hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. St. Luke 19:41 through 42. Today's gospel reading places us in the middle of Jesus Christ's triumphal entry into Jerusalem. We celebrate this day more fully on Palm Sunday, but here in the middle of Trinity season, we get one more chance to meditate on the day God the Son was met with joy and fanfare and hope. Being 2,000 years removed from the event, it can be difficult for us to fully understand what hope these cheering people placed on the shoulders of this young rabbi riding on a donkey. But we can penetrate that distance ourselves by going back to two important moments in the story God is writing through the sons and daughters of his covenant partner, Abraham. That is key to understanding the biblical story as a total. God deals with humanity on a personal basis. He is not aloof or absent. He knows us better than we know ourselves, and there is no sin that can be hidden from him, nor any injustice done against us that he will not personally avenge with a perfect justice that revenge could never truly satisfy. God knows Adam and Eve. He knows Noah. He knows Abraham. And it is through Abraham that God makes his world-salvaging covenant. Now we follow this solemn promise, this treaty between God and man through the pain and misery of Abraham's children. A people who were chosen by God to be the representatives of the whole human race, but unfortunately still suffered under the influence of the evil and sin that corrupts and darkens our resemblance to the God in whose image we all are made. It is because of this terrible corruption, which in Israel eventually culminated in child sacrifice, exploitation of widows and orphans, and idol worship. It is that corruption is why God allows his covenant people to be ravaged and destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BC. But before that first destruction of Jerusalem and its temple and the exile of its people, the already captured and exiled priest Ezekiel had a terrible vision. In the 10th chapter of the book in which he relates his personal interactions with God, Ezekiel writes, Then the glory of the Lord went out from the threshold of the temple and stood over the cherubim. And the cherubim lifted up their wings and mounted up from the earth before my eyes as they went out, with the wheels beside them. And they stood at the entrance of the east gate of the house of the Lord, and the glory of the God of Israel was over them. Ezekiel 10:18 through 19. Here, we see a reluctant God leave his temple, surrounded by his heavenly messengers, his royal retinue, in a royal procession to the east. Here, the great tragedy for the world was not that the Jewish people were stolen from their land by the Babylonians, although that was a terrible thing. The true tragedy for mankind was that we lost our formal access to God through the temple. In the failure of mankind's covenant people, we see a return to the horrible disaster of the fall of man, when Adam rebelled and lost fellowship with his Creator and plunged the world into shadow. In the rubble of this first destruction of Jerusalem, the dream of a peaceful world seemed to lie as dead as the men and women who believed that their high walls and beautiful buildings would save them. To make matters even worse, the rightful representatives of the people, the heirs of Moses and Aaron and David, were all punished for their evil at the hands of the heathen Babylonian executioners. The priests were killed in the temple they profaned, and King Zedekiah fled with his army, leaving the city to be ravaged and destroyed. Eventually, the Babylonians caught the cowardly king and murdered his sons before his eyes, and then blinded him, so that the last thing he ever saw before perpetual darkness was the death of his sons and the end of the kings of Judah. The protection of God had been withdrawn, and the great tide of sin and evil had washed over the city of peace, leaving nothing standing except a memory. Psalm 137 captures this lament of a broken people. It reads, "By the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept when we remembered thee, O Sion. As for our harps, we hang them up upon the trees that are therein. For they that led us away captive required of us then a song, and melody in our heaviness. Sing us one of the songs of Sion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. Yea, if I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy." Psalm 137, 1 through 6. Anguish, regret, bitter memory. It's the fall all over again. Ezekiel sees all of this before it happens, and he tries to warn the people, but he is ignored and beaten and ridiculed, just like Jeremiah and Isaiah and all the prophets who were persecuted by the very people they were trying to save. Their call to turn back to God was ignored for the thrill of becoming like the evil lands that surrounded them. And in the end, the people got their wish. They became just like the evil countries that surrounded them. And they were destroyed, just like all the evil countries that appear and seem mighty for a season, and then fall like last year's leaves. But thankfully, far later in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 43, God shows Ezekiel something else. He writes, "Then he led me to the gate facing east. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the east. And the sound of his coming was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. And the vision I saw was just like the vision I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and just like the vision I had seen by the Chebar Canal. And I fell on my face as the glory of the Lord entered the temple by the gate facing east. The Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple." Ezekiel 43, 1 through 5. It is this prophecy of hope and renewal that becomes so important to a people who realize that Ezekiel was right all along. It was the prophecy that Ezra and Nehemiah hoped would come to pass when they led a remnant of Judah back from Babylon 70 years later, rebuilt the temple, only to find that their good intentions were not enough to save Judea and the world. No, it would take much more than that to save the world. It would take a resurrection of Israel in the man who fulfills everything that Moses and Aaron and David and the temple were always pointing towards. It takes the return of God in the first and last prophet, priest, and king, the heir of Moses and Aaron and David. It takes Jesus Christ. And that is exactly what's happening here on this road to Jerusalem. Jesus fulfills the prophecy of Ezekiel by returning to the city from the east. And he fulfills the messianic prophecy of Zechariah by returning to Jerusalem on the back of a never-before-ridden donkey colt. He enters Jerusalem as Solomon did on the way to be anointed king of Israel. Jesus travels up the mountain to Jerusalem as people around him are singing songs of praise and throwing their garments in the road, preparing themselves for the great day of the Lord. As Zechariah writes, the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. On that day there shall be no light, cold, or frost, and there shall be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening time there shall be light. On that day living waters shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea, and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter, and the Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day the Lord will be one, and his name one. Completeness, glory, victory. The prophecy seems to be fulfilled. The people following Jesus are expecting this prophecy to come true right before their eyes. But suddenly, our Lord stops the parade and begins to weep. The entire momentum of the great story of God and his covenant people is being consummated in the everlasting King David approaching Jerusalem, and he is overcome with grief. Why? Our Lord is overcome with grief to the surprise of everyone around him and to the surprise of us. Because the true Jerusalem, the true city of God's peace, the capital city of the new world to come, is not the city that lies before him. Now, we can only begin to understand our Lord's emotional cry when we consider just what he's going through. Remember, Jesus is completely God, but he is also completely man. He's not pretending to be a human. He has lived his whole life as a Jew, praying for Jerusalem's salvation in synagogue and temple, being surrounded by the hopes and dreams of a people, praying to be liberated from their Gentile slave masters. And he has come to do just that, to free them in this new Exodus. But he also knows that he will be rejected and murdered by the very people he has come to save. He knows that the city of peace, what Jerusalem means, that city of peace will be given a choice in the Holy Week to follow. Peace between God and man, or war. And the city's leaders will foolishly choose war, nailing God to a tree in the great culmination of mankind's desperate and mad rebellion against our Creator. And make no mistake, it is war that they will get, as Jesus foretells today. For the days will come upon Jerusalem when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. St. Luke 19:43-44. There is no joy in this pronouncement from our Lord. No gloating, no "I told you so." It is simply the rightful justice that will come upon a corrupt and evil city that chooses to blind itself as its great prince is murdered before their eyes. Now, the judgment against Jerusalem would come in AD 70, when the Emperor Vespasian's son Titus burned Jerusalem to the ground, tore down its temple, and replaced it with a temple to Jupiter. The Romans even changed the name of the city to Aelia Capitolina, a name it would keep for 600 years until invaders adhering to the new Islamic faith would conquer it yet again. To punctuate this message, Jesus enters the temple and symbolically destroys it by cleansing the market that had developed in the court of the Gentiles. As we read in the last book of the Old Testament, the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple like a refiner's fire. Malachi 3, 1 through 2. God comes to his city with tears and his temple with fire. This is what it looks like to declare war against God. This is the beginning of the end of the city. Now, the unsettling part of today's gospel, something no myth maker would create, is this moment of sadness from God the Son. He looks out on the capital of the Jewish people, itself a part of the greatest Gentile empire the world had ever known, and he knows it's just not going to be enough. All of that glory will not be enough to save the world. It is something to consider that if Jerusalem isn't a holy enough city, what hope can be drawn for the great capitals of our own day? What hope can be gained from these comforting monuments to our own power and might? The answer, quite frankly, is none. The only real hope, the only hope of the Bible, lies in the true Jerusalem. The Jerusalem not made with hands, which Jesus allows St. John, the apostle he loved so much he put in charge of his own mother. He allows that apostle to see and report that city back to us. As John writes in his book, Revelation, "And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away.'" Revelation 21, 2 through 4. St. John is blessed to see the capital of forever. And it is a city where every day is Easter. A place where the fall and exile and the war between God and man is over forever. That is the hope of humanity. And we know it is coming because the prince we murdered rose as the undeniable forerunner of life after death, peace after war, glory after suffering. That prince we murdered rose a king. The applications of this message of real hope in a seemingly hopeless world are truly endless. For example, any person who witnessed the horrific events in Charlottesville last week knows that there are a lot of people who are putting their hope in a fictional story that they find much more compelling than the numbing dystopia being built around us. Naturally, pulpits throughout the land will spend today denouncing the confused, play-acting Nazis who paraded around UVA in Halloween costumes. There will be a lot of head-shaking and stern denunciations of National Socialism, and everyone will leave feeling a little bit better about themselves. Now, of course, any ideology of racial superiority is totally incompatible with the beautiful, multi-ethnic New Earth St. John describes in Revelation. That's why so many of these neo-Nazis are turning to Norse mythology and Gothic paganism for their inspiration. But what do we really gain by denouncing several hundred lost souls who need the gospel just as much as we do? Our main concern with both the neo-Nazis and the neo-communists should not be, how can I use this event to make myself look good? How can I signal that I'm virtuous through these people? No. Our question we should be asking ourselves is, how do I bring the true story of God's world-saving work through Christ to these desperate souls? Anyone who is walking around with a swastika is desperate. When our focus shifts in that direction, we can then once again be scandalized by the gospel ourselves. For it is very, very easy to denounce Nazis. It is much harder to face the fact that our nation and all the nations that spilled so much blood to stop Hitler's legions have basically adopted his dark and twisted approach to human life. For example, taken almost at random, this week CBS News triumphantly declared that Iceland is on pace to eliminate Down syndrome within their island nation. They are eliminating Down syndrome by murdering children who show any signs of the chromosomal disorder in the womb. When I heard this story, I couldn't help but think of this beautiful little boy who's on my way home every day. And he's dropped off from his little bus, and he stands there and he waves at everybody as they come by. Every single person. And every time, every day, it's just a new day. It's the same joy in his face. He's just sharing love with abandon to anyone who will come by. How do we calculate the joy that boy brings into the world? How do we calculate the joy that boy brings to God? I can't. Iceland and England are executing 95 to 99% of these children. America is somewhere between 70 and 90% and rising every year. We're on our way to becoming the master race. If Jesus Christ crested a hill and looked down on Reykjavik or London or Washington, D.C., what would his reaction be? How would it be anything but tears and wrath? What will our King's reaction be when he returns to bring justice for the widows and orphans, the aborted and the poor? Our loving God assures all victims that vengeance is coming, justice is coming, a new world is coming. A world in which all those who have been wronged by the powerful will be seated in places of honor at the great feast presided over by the God who is ripped apart by the sin and evil that makes suffering necessary. The God who wept at the evil of men. May we be seated at that table as well. For the only tears shed on that day will be tears of joy, shared in the loving embrace of those saints. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the